Welcome back, everyone, to Green Dolphin Science.
Great to be back.
Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of a particular fish, the Pacific Saury. You know, that small, silvery fish you find right across the North Pacific.
That's the one. And they're more important than you might think, both for the ocean ecosystem itself and, well, they end up on dinner plates in quite a few countries.
Absolutely. And our focus today is a really interesting study looking at mercury levels in these saury.
Specifically, fish caught off the coast of East Japan back in 2018.
Right. And mercury, well, it's a pollutant we hear a lot about. This study gives us a window into how it moves through the marine food web, using the saury as a kind of guide for us.
Exactly, a key indicator.
So our mission today is to trace that journey of mercury. How does it get into these fish? What does that tell us about the health of the North Pacific?
And interestingly, we might uncover some surprising differences between the eastern and western parts of the ocean.
Sounds fascinating. Okay, let's jump in. Mercury, we know it's bad, generally speaking, but where does it actually come from when we're talking about the oceans?
Well, mercury, Hg, it's actually a natural element. You get it from things like volcanoes erupting, rocks weathering over time.
Okay, so some of it's just there naturally.
Yes, but human activities have really ramped up the amount in the environment. Think mining, industrial pollution, even some agricultural practices.
And it sticks around, doesn't it? It's not like it just breaks down quickly.
That's the key problem. It's persistent, and it bioaccumulates. It builds up in living things.
So once it gets into the ocean, it starts moving into the marine life.
Pretty much. It starts at the bottom, with tiny organisms absorbing it from the water. Then slightly larger creatures eat those tiny ones.
And the mercury gets passed along.
Exactly. And it gets more concentrated at each step up the food chain. That's the bioaccumulation part. Fish, especially predatory ones, often end up with the highest levels.
Which brings us neatly back to the Pacific Saury. Why are they such a good focus for this kind of study?
Well, the Pacific Saury colobacera is the scientific name, is what we call a small pelagic fish. It lives in the open ocean, and it migrates over huge distances in the North Pacific.
So it covers a lot of ground, or rather, water.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
And it's economically quite important in places like Japan, China, Russia, Korea, Taiwan. It's a common food source there.
Culturally important, too, I imagine.
Definitely. And ecologically, it's a crucial link. It eats tiny stuff like plankton and krill. The study specifically mentions euphausiids, like E. pacifica.
Krill, right.
And even small fish eggs, or larvae. Then, in turn, bigger fish, seabirds, they all prey on the saury.
So it's right there in the middle of the food web.
Precisely. A mid-trophic species. And
Wow.
studying mercury in these middle-level organisms is really valuable because, honestly, we don't have a ton of data for that part of the food web.
That makes sense. Fill the knowledge gap.
Yeah. And there's a specific type of mercury we really need to focus on here, methylmercury, MEGEG.
Methylmercury. That rings a bell as being the particularly nasty kind.
It is. It's highly toxic, and it's the form that most readily enters the food web. It starts with phytoplankton, the microscopic ocean plants, absorbing it.
Okay.
Then it kind of bioconcentrates in the seawater itself and builds up in organisms. Understanding how that form accumulates in fish people eat, like saury, is vital for, health risk assessments and managing pollution.
Okay, so mercury's out there. It's building up especially as methylmercury, and the saury is a key player. How did this specific study go about measuring it?
So the researchers in this 2018 study, they wanted to compare mercury accumulation in the eastern versus the western North Pacific. They collected their saury samples off East Japan, which is in the western part.
Right.
They analyzed the muscle tissue for total mercury, THG, but they also looked at stable isotopes, carbon, 13C, and nitrogen, 15N.
Stable isotopes. We've talked about these before, but quick refresher, what do they tell us again?
Sure, think of them like natural chemical fingerprints. Carbon isotopes can hint at where the fish was feeding sort of coastal versus open ocean food sources. And nitrogen isotopes, 15N, they're really good for figuring out the trophic level, basically where the fish sits on the food chain. Higher 15N generally means higher up.
Higher up the pyramid, gotcha.
Yeah. They also measured the fish length, estimated age, and they cross-referenced with other studies about what saury generally eat: plankton, zooplankton, krill.
So what were the mercury levels like in these Japanese saury? Was it cause for alarm?
Well, the results showed total mercury ranging from about 0.017 up to 0.082 micrograms per gram wet weight. The average was 0.042.
And how does that compare to, say, safety limits?
Good news there, actually. Those levels are below the international guidelines for safe consumption.
Phew. Great.
But they did find a clear pattern. There was a positive correlation. The bigger the saury, the higher the mercury concentration tended to be.
Which makes sense, right? Older, bigger fish have just had more time to accumulate it through their diet.
Exactly. They mostly looked at age 1 saury, as those were most common in their catch. But yeah, the trend pointed towards older fish having higher mercury, too. It's pretty common finding in fish studies.
And what about the diet? Did the isotopes confirm what they thought the saury were eating?
They did. The average isotope values were around negative 20.7 per mil for carbon after correction and 8.0 per mil for nitrogen.
Okay.
And they used these statistical models, Bayesian mixing models, to compare the saury signatures with their potential prey.
Bayesian mixing models. Sounds complicated. What's the basic idea?
Yeah. Basically, it's a way to statistically estimate the most likely mix of different food sources that contributed to the fish's diet based on those isotope fingerprints.
Like figuring out a recipe from the taste.
Kinda, yeah. And the model strongly suggested that Euphausiids krill were the main ingredient, making up over 70% of the diet for the saury they studied.
Wow, so they really rely heavily on krill. Seems like it. Though they did see hints that the youngest fish, the age-low ones, maybe ate a bit more zooplankton. Smaller prey for smaller fish, makes sense. But overall, krill dominated.
And did this link back to the mercury levels?
Yes, significantly. They found a strong positive relationship between the log of the mercury concentration and the nitrogen isotope value, the A15N. That included the whole food web family. They looked at phytoplankton, zooplankton, krill, and the saury.
So clear evidence of biomagnification. Higher up the food chain, higher the mercury.
Precisely. The mercury is definitely concentrating as it moves up from the krill to the saury in the western North Pacific.
Okay, and this is where I remember it getting really interesting in the paper, the comparison between the western North Pacific, where they took their samples, and the eastern North Pacific, using data from other studies. What were the differences?
Yeah, this was quite striking. When they compared their western Pacific data to published data from the East Pacific, they found saury in the west had lower A15N values.
Lower trophic level, based on nitrogen. Apparently, yes. But, and this is the key part, they had higher total mercury concentrations. Significantly higher.
Wait, lower on the food chain but more mercury? How does that work? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? That's what makes it so interesting. The mercury levels in the western saury were, on average, at least double those in the east. About 0.042 micrograms per gram in the west versus 0.017 in the east.
Double. Wow. And the nitrogen levels?
Also quite different. Average 15 in the west was around 8.7 per mil, but in the east it was much higher, averaging 13.2 per mil.
Okay, so what's going on? Why such big differences across the same ocean?
The researchers suggest a couple of major factors could be at play. The higher nitrogen values in the east might be related to ocean dynamics there, specifically upwelling.
Where deeper, nutrient-rich water comes to the surface.
Exactly, that can affect the nitrogen isotope baseline right at the bottom of the food web. But the mercury difference, that likely points to pollution sources. The western North Pacific is much closer to East Asia, which historically has been the largest source of anthropogenic mercury emissions globally.
So more mercury going into the water in the first place in the west.
That's the strong hypothesis. High baseline levels of mercury in the seawater near those emission sources.
And the saury just soak it up?
Well, they live there. Their migration patterns tend to keep them primarily within those western North Pacific waters. So they're constantly exposed to potentially higher environmental mercury levels.
That paints a pretty clear, if slightly concerning picture. Now, the study didn't claim to have all the answers, right? They mentioned limitations.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good science always acknowledges what it doesn't know yet. A major point was the scarcity of mercury data overall for saury across the entire North Pacific.
Especially methylmercury data.
Yes, especially MEDEG, and particularly for the eastern North Pacific. We really need more comprehensive, up-to-date sampling across the board to get the full picture.
And the food web analysis, those Bayesian models, they were useful, but maybe a bit simplified.
Right. They provide a good estimate, but they do lump prey categories together. The paper suggests future work could use more advanced techniques, like compound-specific isotope analysis of amino acids, CSIA-AA.
That sounds even more technical.
It gives you a much finer-grained view of the diet, potentially distinguishing between different types of zooplankton or phytoplankton more clearly.
And what about looking beyond just saury? How does this fit into the bigger mercury picture in the North Pacific?
Well, the study authors suggest incorporating data from top predators, like tuna species found in the region. That would help understand how mercury continues to biomagnify up to the very top of the food web.
Connect the dots all the way up.
Exactly. And they also highlight that Saury, because they have a relatively short life cycle and are so widespread, could be really valuable as bioindicators.
Like canaries in the coal mine, but for ocean mercury.
Sort of, yeah. Using them for long-term monitoring could help us track how mercury levels are changing over time and in different areas. That kind of monitoring is crucial.
So let's bring it back for everyone listening. What's the big takeaway here? This relatively small fish is telling us quite a lot.
It really is. It shows how far-reaching mercury pollution is, affecting ecosystems far out in the open ocean. And it reveals these really interesting subtle differences between different ocean regions.
That higher mercury level in the western North Pacific, potentially tied to human emissions from East Asia, is a pretty stark reminder, isn't it?
It absolutely underscores the need for continued global efforts to reduce mercury pollution. Our actions on land have very direct consequences out at sea.
And the isotope differences suggesting different food web structures or baselines, it just shows how complex these marine environments are.
Yeah, it's not just one uniform ocean. There's this interplay of ocean currents, nutrient availability, pollution inputs, feeding patterns. It all affects how contaminants like mercury move.
Which leaves us with a really important question, I think. How are these regional differences in mercury affecting everything else out there, other marine lives, and potentially the people who eat seafood from these different areas?
That's the crucial next step, understanding those broader impacts. It really emphasizes that what we do matters, even in the seemingly remote vastness of the ocean.
Definitely food for thought. If you're interested in digging deeper, you could look into the work of the North Pacific Fisheries Commission or just general research on mercury in marine food webs.
The story of the Pacific Saury really is a great window into this much larger, critical environmental challenge we face.
It certainly is. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us on Green Dolphin Science.
My pleasure.